The older woman's hands grip the deadheading shears at the back of a perennial border, the kneeling pad warm through, the August heat heavy on her shoulders, the petunias finished, the daylilies blown, the calendar still reading 2 months until the first hard frost. Most gardeners answer that calendar with replacement. They drive to the garden centre, fill another flat of annuals, add another bend, another row, another bag of mulch. The shears come out again on Saturday morning. But the European cottage gardeners and the desert ethnobotanists who study lasting blooms have found something that changes everything about how a perennial bed is built. In almost every case, the longest blooming perennials in the bed are not the ones the garden centre stocks. They are the ones the garden centre forgot. 12 plants that bloom from late May until the first hard frost. 5 to 6 months of colour, without a single deadheading session, without dividing, without bending. 12 of them to be exact. Plants that European trial gardens have logged blooming over 150 days a season. Plants that Sonoran desert tribes carried for 2,000 years through ground too dry for any flat from a chain nursery. Plants that the commercial garden industry has quietly buried because nothing replaceable sells like an annual. There is no shelf space in a Mexican fleabane. This is the story of those 12, what each one does, why each one outlasts the salvia and the coreopsis, and the mistake nearly every home gardener makes when reaching for the shears in late July. The first is the twin spur, Diacia, trailing, pink, easy to overlook on a bench at the garden centre next to the trumpeting petunias. Ask the staff what it is, and the answer is usually a shrug. Ask what it does, and the shrug deepens. It blooms longer than any annual on that bench, 6 months, sometimes 7. The pink and coral come from anthocyanins, the pigment family that colours a beet, an aging maple leaf, a glass of red wine. The plant carries iridoid glycosides in its tissue, bitter compounds that browsing rabbits and deer notice and refuse. South African in origin, from the Drakensberg highlands, where summers swing hot and cool in a single afternoon, and the plant holds its blooms through weather that flattens everything around it. Most flowering plants set seed and shut down. They register the seed set, signal complete, close the cycle. Diacia does not. The plant treats each bloom as a fresh start, pushing another flush from the leaf axils, then another, all the way until the temperature drops below the point its tissue can hold. Most gardeners get told to deadhead it. The advice is close to wrong. What the plant needs is a single midsummer cutback. 1 cut, 10 minutes of work, no kneeling. The daily deadheading routine that the garden columns prescribe wears the gardener out long before it does anything for the plant. Skip the deadheading, let it run. Plant it in well-drained soil at the front of a border, 8 inches between plants. Mulch lightly. Water in the first season. After that, leave it. The flowers come in clusters of small bells, the colour of a grapefruit segment held against the sun. Picture a border that begins blooming in late April and is still blooming when the daylilies have surrendered, when the petunias have crisped to brown paper, when the neighbour is buying a 3rd flat of replacements. The Diacia is still going. Pink, coral, dependable. A flat of replacement annuals at a chain garden centre runs $18 to $24. Multiply by 3 flats a season. Multiply by every gardener on the block. The lawn and garden industry is built on replacement. A perennial that blooms 6 months at the price of a single starter plant is a slow leak in the model. Diacia is not stocked at most chains. The reason is not horticultural, but Diacia still asks for 1 cut. The next plant on the list does not. It sways instead. The second is Gora lindheimeri, the whirling butterflies. Tall, thin-stemmed, the flowers small and pale, almost easy to mistake for a weed when first planted. The whole plant looks unfinished. Then the wind moves through it, and the flowers seem to take flight without leaving the stem. The plant carries the name of Ferdinand Lindheimer, the German-Texan botanist, who walked the prairies of Texas from 1843 onward and shipped seeds and herbarium sheets back to Harvard. Lindheimer is called the father of Texas botany. He found this plant blooming in pasture ground that had never been irrigated. in soil too poor for cotton. The flowers open from the base of long flowering stems and climb upward over weeks. As one flower fades, another opens above it. Motion at every height of the stem all summer. The wind keeps the bloom in continuous rotation. Gardeners reach for the shears when the lower stem looks tired. The plant does not need it. What looks tired is just the bottom of a stem still pushing flowers at the top. Cutting it back resets the bloom to zero, surrendering 4 to 6 weeks of colour for nothing. Plant in poor, well-drained soil. The richer the soil, the floppier the plant. Skip the fertiliser entirely. Stake nothing. Late August, when most perennial beds have gone quiet, the gora is still in motion. Pink-white flowers bobbing on stems 3 feet above the foliage, like a slow horizon dance the bed never finishes. A bed that no longer needs the gardener to tend it. The wind does the work the shears would have. The flower that bends does not need a hand. Gora sways. It does not need cutting. But the next plant does something the wind cannot. It calls the bees from a quarter-mile away. The third is Calamintha nepeta, lesser calamint, a low, mounded plant with leaves that smell of crushed mint when brushed. The flowers tiny, white tinged with lavender, easy to dismiss at a distance. Up close the plant is humming. Bees on every flower head, all day, June through October. The leaves carry peulagon, menthone and isomenthone, the essential oil compounds that give the plant its scent and the bees their signal. The same family of compounds the ancient Romans cooked into stomach tonics. Galen wrote about calamint in the 2nd century. Pliny named it among the household plants kept by Roman cooks. The plant has been in continuous cultivation in Mediterranean kitchen gardens for nearly 2,000 years. A field of calamint is a kind of bee chapel. The peulagon vapour rises from the leaves on warm afternoons, drifting on the breeze, drawing bees from a quarter-mile out. The plant does not advertise. It scents the air. Gardeners plant a single specimen and call the job done. One calamint barely registers. The plant works in drifts. Plant 5, plant 9, plant a long ribbon of it along a path, and the air itself begins to hum. Plant in lean, well-drained soil, full sun, 12 inches apart. Skip the compost. Skip the fertiliser. Lean ground produces stronger oil. A small garden where the bees are louder than the lawn mowers 2 yards over. A bee is louder than any catalogue. The bee decline papers of the last decade name habitat loss as the leading driver. The same garden columns that ran the bee decline pieces still recommended hybrid annuals that produce no nectar. Calamintha was rarely on the list. Calamintha calls the bees. The next plant catches them in another shape entirely, a pincushion. The fourth is Canortia macedonica, crimson pincushion flowers on long, thin stems. The kind of flower that catches the eye, not because it shouts, but because the colour is deeper than what is around it. Bordeaux, blood. Old velvet. The plant carries the name of Christoph Knaut, the German botanist who died in 1694, 3 years before Linnaeus was born. Knaut catalogued the plants in the kitchen gardens of Saxony. The Macedonica species came later, named for the wild ranges of the southern Balkans, where it bloomed in pasture from May through October without irrigation. A single Canortia flower head is not one flower. It is dozens. Each pincushion is a composite of small disc and ray florets, opening sequentially over weeks. One flower head can stay in bloom for nearly 3 weeks. The plant produces dozens of heads. The math runs to 400 days of cumulative flower across a single specimen in a single season. Now here is a point where much of the common gardening advice is simply wrong, and it is worth pausing on. Garden books recommend cutting Canortia back hard after the first flush to force a second flush. The advice came from one mid-20th century English garden book and has been copied for 50 years. The plant does not need it. The blooms cycle naturally without intervention. The hard cutback resets the plant to zero, losing 4 to 6 weeks of bloom for no gain. The deadheading instruction that follows in those same books is also wrong. A conortia that stops blooming midsummer rarely stops because of the gardener. Three causes do most of the work: soil too rich, too much summer water, or planting in afternoon shade. The cure is none of the above. The cure is patience. The plant resumes within a week. Plant in lean soil, full sun, well drained. Group in 3s or 5s. Mulch lightly the first year. Conortia, calamintha, and Verbena bonariensis, planted as a guild, create a long bloom pollinator stack. The conortia provides the deep nectar pool. The calamintha scents the air for a quarter mile. The verbena draws butterflies above the bee layer, building a vertical pollinator architecture without a single annual replaced. The conortia is an architecture in itself. The next plant on the list takes the same compound idea and turns it golden. Late summer, mist over the bed. The fifth is Perennia scabiosifolia. Tall, airy, golden. A haze of small yellow flowers held above feathery foliage. The plant looks like a piece of late summer light, caught and held still. Most American gardeners have never seen it. Most Japanese gardeners have known it for 1,000 years. The plant produces perenniosides, triterpenoid saponins documented in Chinese herbal medicine since the time of the Benkao texts. The compound family is bitter, anti-inflammatory in traditional use, and unpalatable to most browsing animals. Perennia is one of the 7 autumn flowers of Japan. Listed in the Manyoshu, the 8th century poetry collection, the flower has been planted in temple gardens for over 1,000 years. The plant blooms when the rest of the perennial bed has begun to fade, late July onward. The flowers are small and many, held in flat-topped clusters on stems that can reach 4 feet. Each cluster opens over a week. The plant produces dozens of clusters in succession, all the way through October. Plant in average soil, full sun to part shade, well drained. Stake nothing. The wiry stems hold themselves. The bloom looks, from across a yard, like a mist of yellow at chest height. Sometimes called the golden lace plant. The bees and small wasps work it constantly through October, a back-of-border position where a bed used to go quiet by August. Now the gold rises every August and stays through October, late, after the goldenrod has finished. The American nursery trade has barely catalogued it. A specialty perennial nursery is the only reliable source. The plant has been in continuous cultivation in Asia for a millennium, and almost nowhere in commercial American garden centres. Perennia rises in August. The next plant on the list rose 6 feet, and butterflies treat it like a lighthouse. The 6th is Verbena bonariensis. Tall, thin-stemmed lavender flowers held 5 feet in the air on stems no thicker than a pencil. The plant looks like it should not stand. It stands. 6 months of bloom, self-seeding, almost no maintenance. The plant carries verbenolin and verbascicide, phenylpropanoid glycosides documented in herbal traditions on 3 continents. Native to South America, the species name is the Latin form of Buenos Aires. Brought into European cultivation in the 1700s. The plant has been a fixture of British cottage gardens for over 2 centuries. The flowers are held on tall, thin stems that move with every breeze, drawing pollinators from above the rest of the bed. Butterflies in particular treat the plant as a beacon. The bloom climbs vertically over weeks, the upper flowers opening as the lower ones set seed, the seed dropping and germinating where it falls. The plant manages its own propagation. Gardeners stake it. The plant does not need staking. The thin stems are designed to flex, not break. Staking forces rigidity into a structure built for motion and tends to snap stems that would have weathered the wind. Plant in lean, well-drained soil. Some. Skip the fertilizer. The seeds will scatter and replant the bed for years. A bed where the verbena rises through and above everything else. Butterflies stack on it. New plants come up every spring without effort. The verbena is South American. The next plant on the list is South African, a relative of the hibiscus. The 7th is Anisodontia, the Cape mallow, a small shrubby perennial covered in pale pink flowers shaped like miniature hibiscus. Native to South Africa, named for the irregular tooth pattern in its leaves. The flowers come and come and come. In zones 8 and warmer, the plant blooms nearly continuously from March through November. The plant comes from the Western Cape, where dry summers and wet winters shaped a rhythm unlike anything in the eastern United States. South African gardeners cultivated it in cottage borders for 200 years before British plantsmen carried it to Kew. The flowers are produced individually along the stem, each lasting a single day. The plant replaces what closes overnight. The cycle continues for 8 months, without the flush and rest pattern that most perennial bloomers run. Northern gardeners give up on it after the first hard frost. The plant is hardy only to zone 7 and warmer. In zones 5 and 6, it is a long-blooming pot plant brought in for winter. The cycle is not failure. The cycle is climate. Plant in well-drained soil, full sun, away from low spots that hold moisture. A single plant fills 3 feet of border. A pink bloom that arrives in March before the perennials have woken and continues until the first frost cuts it back. 8 months of colour. The chain garden centres stock the Cape mallow rarely and only in coastal regions. The plant is too long-lived for a season replacement model. The Anisodontia is South African. The next plant on the list arrived from Mexico and quietly stitched itself into the wall cracks of half the world. The 8th is Erigeron carvinskianus, the Mexican fleabane. Small white and pink daisies on a sprawling, low plant. The flowers begin white and age to pink, so a single plant carries both colours at once. The whole effect looks like a miniature meadow stitched into the cracks of a stone wall. The species was named for Wilhelm Friedrich von Karwinski, the Bavarian naturalist who collected plants in Mexico from 1827 to 1832 and shipped them back to European herbaria. The plant has been in European cottage gardens since. The plant self-seeds without becoming weedy. Seedlings establish in cracks of stone, gravel paths, the joints of dry-laid walls. Each plant blooms for 6 months. The colony renews itself indefinitely without intervention. Gardeners pull it. The plant looks weedy when young. The mistake is in the eye, not the plant. A single Mexican fleabane left alone for 2 years becomes a low ground cover more refined than anything sold by the flat. Scatter seed in early spring on poor soil, gravel, or wall crevices. Water once, walk away. The plant outcompetes invasive weeds in the same niche it occupies. A driveway edge or stone wall base seeded with Mexican fleabane stays free of bindweed and chickweed without herbicide. The plant suppresses what the gardener would otherwise spend Saturday mornings pulling. A wall that blooms from April to November. A driveway edge that is no longer a chore. A patio crack that is, instead, a quiet little garden of its own. There is no shelf space in a Mexican fleabane. The plant seeds itself and lasts decades, and a packet of seed costs the price of a single coffee. The chain nursery does not stock what does not return revenue. The fleabane stitches the cracks. The next plant rises 4 feet above the bed and burns crimson into October. The 9th is Persicaria amplexicaulis, mountain fleece. A tall, vigorous perennial that throws bottlebrush spikes of crimson, magenta, or pink 4 feet up over deep green foliage. The blooms keep coming from June through hard frost. The plant is a true Persicaria, the genus that includes smartweeds and bistorts, catalogued in herbal traditions across Asia and Europe for centuries. Tannins, anthocyanins, and astringent compounds in the foliage. Native to the high Himalayas. Grown in British borders since the late 1800s. The cultivar Firetail is the standard, with crimson spikes that hold their colour from late June to October. The plant blooms in spike and replace cycles. Each bottlebrush stays open for 2 to 3 weeks. The clump produces dozens of spikes through the season. The total bloom hours run to 4 months without intervention. Gardeners cut it back midsummer to tidy it. The cut removes flowering spikes that have not yet opened. The plant is not unruly. The plant is committed. Plant in moist, average soil, sun to part shade. Group in 3s or 5s for visual mass. Skip the staking. a back-of-border position where the bed used to go quiet in late summer. Now the spikes rise 4 feet, crimson, until the frost takes them down in November. The plant is one of the few perennials that holds a vivid red colour into October without fading. Photographers and painters in cottage garden circles return to it for the same reason. Persicaria reaches up. The next plant on the list reaches inward, a North American native used by traditional medicine for over 200 years. The 10th is Scutellaria incana, hoary skullcap, two-toned blue and white flowers held in a vertical spike. The plant is upright, 3 feet tall, with grey-green leaves. The bloom is unmistakable, the kind of blue that does not appear elsewhere in a perennial border. The leaves and roots carry scutellarin, bicoline and bicolin, flavonoids documented in both traditional Eastern medicine and the American eclectic tradition. The compound family is sedative and anti-inflammatory in traditional use. The 1898 King's American Dispensatory listed Scutellaria as a nervine, a calming agent, used by the eclectic physicians of the 1830 to 1939 era for nervous exhaustion and insomnia. The native range runs from Pennsylvania west to Iowa. The plant blooms in successive whorls up the spike, with new flowers opening at the top as the lower ones complete. The bloom runs from late June through September. The plant tolerates dry ground better than most natives. Plant in average to dry soil, sun to part shade. The plant is drought tolerant once established. Skip the irrigation after the first season. The blue is unusually saturated for a flower at 3 feet of height. Bumblebees in particular work the spikes constantly through July and August. A native plant in a native bed, blooming for 3 full months, while the imported salvias around it have already given up. The native plant nursery trade carries it. The chain garden centre does not. The reason is the same as the others on this list. The skullcap is a North American native. The next plant on the list is one too, a low desert daisy that blooms 10 months a year. The 11th is Tetranuris acaulis, the Angelita daisy, a low, tufted plant with bright yellow daisies held just above grey-green foliage. Native to the high plains and the southwestern deserts, in its home range, the plant blooms 10 months a year. The plant carries helenalin in the foliage, a sesquiterpene lactone documented across the genus, bitter and unpalatable to browsing animals. The plant is rabbit-proof, deer-proof, and drought-proof. The species grows wild from Texas to the Dakotas, on ground too dry and too thin for most cultivated perennials. Indigenous peoples of the southern plains used related species in medicinal preparations for centuries. The plant is a short-stemmed clump former. The flowers rise on stalks 4 to 6 inches tall and replace themselves for 10 months in mild climates, 6 months in the upper Midwest. Almost no rest period. Gardeners overwater it. The plant's root architecture is built for dryness. Excess water causes rot, the only reliable failure mode. The plant prefers neglect to attention. Plant in poor, gritty, well-drained soil, full sun. Skip the irrigation entirely after establishment. Do not amend the soil. A bed at the southern edge of a yard, in the kind of dry, gravelly ground where most perennials sulk. The Angelita daisy blooms there, yellow, constant. Plant the Angelita daisy with the desert globe mallow, the next plant on the list, and a xeric guild forms. Root depths complementing each other. No irrigation, no fertilizer, no shears. Full bloom from March until November. The Angelita daisy holds the dry ground. But there is one more plant, older than King's American Dispensatory, older than Lindheimer, older than the United States. The 12th and last is Sphaeralcea ambigua, the desert globe mallow. Apricot orange cup-shaped flowers held on grey-leaved stems, blooming through the dry months when nothing else in the desert dares. The plant is humble. The plant is ancient. The flowers and leaves carry malvidin glycosides for colour and abundant mucilage in the tissue, the slick, soothing gel that the entire mallow family is known for. The mucilage is what mattered. The Tohono O'odham, the Pima, and the Hopi peoples used the desert globe mallow for centuries before the first Spanish mission appeared in the southwest. Archaeological evidence places mallow use well before 1492. The Tohono O'odham word for the plant translates as a plant that heals the throat. Spanish missionaries, arriving in the 1700s, recorded its use in their journals. The plant is built for the long dry. Deep taproots that find water below the topsoil. Silvery hairs on the leaves that reflect sun and trap moisture. A bloom cycle that runs from March through November in mild zones, longer than any perennial sold at any chain. Northern gardeners try to grow it in heavy clay and overwater it. The plant suffers in either condition. The plant is built for thin, dry, mineral soil. Plant in sandy or gravelly soil. Full sun, no irrigation after establishment. The Sonoran desert tribes called the practice of leaving mallow in place the long keeping. What does not need tending is what stays longest in the ground. Pair it with the Angelita daisy. The two cover the bed at different heights and bloom at different rhythms, the daisy at 6 inches, the globe mallow at 3 feet. Together they hold a desert bed for 2/3 of the year. A flower the Tohono O'odham kept alive for 2,000 years. A flower the Chain Garden Centre has never stocked. What the Tohono kept, the catalogue could not improve. The commercial nursery trade in the southwest still pushes water-thirsty East Coast hybrids. Aquifer levels have dropped in the Sonoran Basin every decade since 1950. The plant that does not need the water has been on the ground the whole time. 12 plants. 12 quiet refusals of the replacement model. The story closes here, but the bed does not. The diasia, the gora, the calamintha, the conortia, the petrinia, the verbena, the anisodontia, the erigeron, the persicaria, the scutellaria, the tetranuris, and the desert globe mallow. Each one blooms longer than the perennial in the catalogue. Each one survives without the shears. Each one gives back the time the bed used to take. 5 to 6 months of bloom without intervention, without bending, without replacement. The longest bloom is the one no one taught the gardener to want. The garden columns prescribed deadheading because the column needed something to print. The chain centre stocked annuals because the bed needed to be rebuilt every spring. The advice and the inventory served the model, not the bed. A bed planted with these 12 never asks for the August Saturday on the kneeling pad, never asks for the third flat of replacement annuals, never asks for the synthetic foliar feed. The dependence breaks. The garden begins to keep itself. Picture the older woman setting the deadheading shears down, the kneeling pad lifted off the ground, the August border still in bloom, the petunias finished, the daylilies blown, the calendar still reading 2 months until the first frost, and the bed not finished at all. The bed just beginning the second half. Tell the comment thread which of the 12 is already in the bed at home and which one is on the list for next spring. Send this to the gardener on the block who is still buying the third flat of annuals. The independence is for them too. The grandmothers who kept these plants alive in cottage gardens for 4 centuries did not have a chain garden centre. They had each other. The lineage continues by passing it forward.